Thank you for availing yourself to help me with this assignment. It's an interview I'm supposed to do in regards to disciplining for special education. Okay,
Are you taking classes to be a teacher?
somewhat, yes, something like that.
Oh, that's awesome. I didn't know. That's good news.
I started after the break. Yeah. Okay, before I begin asking you the questions, could you state your name and your occupation, please, and where you work?
Okay, so Jennifer Lowe, I'm the assistant principal at Seminole Trails Elementary.
Okay, so I'll be asking you approximately 7 or so questions in regards to special education and the discipline.
Okay.
So my first question is, in your role, what types of discipline issues have you found to be the most common with students with disabilities?
I think there is a large degree of variance in discipline depending on what the child's disability is. Some students, you may just have a language or speech eligibility, so you may not see, much difference. It might just be, similar to typical students. However, with students with autism, sometimes they have difficulty self-regulating their emotions, so you might see them trying to elope from the room or having a temper tantrum, if there's a change in routine,
Right.
which you often see in the classroom.
Yes, I do.
And a lot of that has to do with, just trying to de-escalate the student. Depending on what level they have cognitively, you have to judge how you handle the discipline related to that. So, for instance, if a student is less verbal, you want to make sure you're not, speaking above what they can understand. So I think that you have to take each student based upon, their own abilities and, approach the situation based upon that.
Okay. So in regards to IDEA, what is your responsibility regarding the discipline components for students identified as receiving special education services?
Well, we have certain paraprofessionals that are IDA paraprofessionals. So depending on if a student needs one-on-one assistance, they may have their own paraprofessional assigned to them to assist with, their own individual needs.
Right.
But everything else goes back to the IEP, the student's IEP. So we have to make sure that we're meeting both their academic and their social emotional needs indicated on the individual education plan.
Okay. So how do you play a role with in-school suspension versus out-of-school suspension for students who receive special education services?
So this is a very hot topic, with students in suspension, especially with students with disabilities. Again, in Palm Beach County, our code of conduct requires that we look at each situation, again, based upon what students can understand and what's appropriate based upon their IEP.
Right.
So, for instance, a student who is on the spectrum for autism that cannot understand what a suspension is,
Right.
that probably wouldn't be the most used form of discipline. However, there are instances where the child is, repeatedly hurting themselves or others, and they may need, a break.
Right.
So you might consider suspension at that point. But it should not be your go-to form of discipline. You want to try other things. Maybe it could be time out in another room,
Right.
or possibly trying them out with another teacher. But we don't want to just go to suspension right away.
Right.
But there are situations where if they're causing injury to themselves or others, that might be considered. Other eligibilities, for instance, if a child it might be language impaired, but they are able to understand the consequences of what they have done,
Right.
and it has been done more than once. Like, for instance, if a student has gotten into a fight multiple times, you might consider suspension at that point if the student can understand what they have done and why that is occurring.
Okay.
So again, students with disabilities, it isn't we don't have a guide that says if a student does this, this is the consequence. We're required to look at each child as an individual.
Okay.
And we have a range of consequences that we can give.
Right.
And suspension should not be your go-to form of discipline. You know, you might want to work with the parents or set up a behavior plan before you consider suspension.
Okay. So how are you involved in the discipline? Sorry, correct. How are you involved in the decision-making process regarding the discipline of these children?
That is a big part of my responsibility. If a student does receive an office discipline referral, I follow the code of conduct, which means for our district, when a student receives a referral, there's a level 1, 2, 3, and 4 offense. And for each level of offense, there is a required range of actions, interventions, and consequences. So I have to look at what happened, and parent contact is always required.
Right.
A student conference is always required.
Okay.
And that may be all that happens, depending on what the situation is.
Okay.
If it's something physical or fighting, which is a level 3 offense,
Right.
that is where you do get into what we call an in-school suspension, where possibly they spend a day in another room,
Okay.
or an out-of-school suspension, or sometimes it's just a lunch detention. But we are given a range that we have to follow, and there are some things that are required, and then there are some things that are suggested.
Okay. Okay, so what types of data do you collect regarding the behavior or discipline issues of students with disabilities?
Okay, depending on where the student is at in the process, for instance, if a child is beginning to display issues with behavior, we have something called the FBA. I don't know if you know what that is, a functional behavior assessment.
Okay.
And that's where the teacher with the ESC team, the child study team, begins collecting data based upon a certain behavior. And then we study what happened, like right before the incident occurred, what happened after, what time of day, and we come up with what we call a BIP, which is a behavior intervention plan. And the teacher and those working with the student will continue to follow that behavior intervention plan using particular interventions and collecting data to see if that behavior decreases.
Okay.
If it does decrease, that's great. If not, we can try other things. And if we are unable to improve the behavior, sometimes it's doing an evaluation and looking at possibly a different eligibility or an increased level of service. That's kind of what starts the process of looking at a behavior as far as offering additional service or change in placement.
Okay, that's interesting. So how are special education services provided to students with disabilities who are suspended if needed?
I believe if it goes past a certain number of days. So a child with an IEP, if it goes beyond 10 days of suspension for the year,
Right.
you have to have a manifestation hearing where we look at the child and determine if their level of service is supporting the child with behavior enough, or if there needs to be a change in the service. If it does go beyond the 10 days, the parent can then look at compensatory time.
Okay. So does your role have responsibilities in determining or providing these services or ensuring these services are met?
It's everyone who's on the child study team for that child is supposed to be following the IEP. But as far as discipline referrals that come to the office, I'm required to make sure that I follow the rules regarding that. You're right.
Okay. This is my final question. What other additional insights can you offer in the areas of due process, discipline, and student or family rights related to your role and responsibilities?
Can you read the question one more time?
What other additional insights can you offer in the areas of due process, discipline, and student or family rights related to your role and responsibilities?
We haven't had any parents go through due process at our school
Okay.
related to that, but due process is when either the school or the parent doesn't agree with the decision and they want to go
Okay.
through the process to rectify the situation.
Right.
So we haven't had any parents recently go through that process. We try to work as a team and compromise and do what's best for the child.
Right.
But we do have, I don't know in your class if you've had to look through the procedural safeguards for families.
No, I wasn't able.
So if you have time to look at it, at every IEP meeting, a parent is offered you have to ask the parent if they want their procedural safeguards read to them, which is all of their rights as a parent with a student that has an IEP. And those are the steps and processes that we're required to follow for the student.
Okay.
If we do not, or the parents do not agree with us, then they can go through this process called due process.
Okay.
But everybody is responsible for following those procedural safeguards. So it's very important for an administrator and for teachers working with students with disabilities and the parents to know what those procedural safeguards are, as well as knowing everything on the IEP, so that you have a solid team to make sure there aren't any problems with the student. You want to make sure everybody's on that same page.
Right. Okay, thank you again, Mrs. Lowe.
Okay,
For your
you're welcome.
assistance, and I will be looking forward to your help if I need it later on in my studies.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And you are working in a very good, classroom environment to pick up on a lot of strategies and, methods for working with students with disabilities. So that's great that you have that opportunity.
Yes, I'm grateful for it too. Thank you.
Yeah, all right. Thank you so much, Ms. Sinclair.
You too, Mrs. Lowe. Have a
Okay.
great summer.
Or
what is left of it. And be
Okay.
safe.
All right.
Okay,
Take care.
thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.